I'm going to talk a little bit about just the general process and how it works. We call it the 101 of financial aid. And then I'm going to get into a lot more of the details and the variety of the types of things that you will see depending on the kinds of schools that are being applied to. And then I'll wrap up with where we are currently in the financial aid environment, what's currently happening, what are some potential pitfalls that you should be keeping an eye on, as well as some new and different things that I think are going to be very positive for you. So let's first start talking about all of the various types of forms that you will need to complete as you go through the financial aid process. They are to the point of either very extensive or very simple. And I'm going to use acronyms, but I'm going to try very hard to make sure that I'm clear with you as to what those acronyms are and what they're for. So let's start with the free financial aid application, which is the FAFSA. That's FAFSA. That is the form that is used for every student to apply for the federal funds. The federal funds are the grant funds, the Pell, the SEOG, the Federal Work Study. SEOG is Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant. Also for any types of loans, federal loan programs, the subsidized loan, the unsubsidized loan. These are all direct loan programs. Every student who is applying for financial aid, regardless of what institution, what kind of institution, public, private, must complete the FAFSA if they are interested in applying for any level of financial aid. That's the first step. It is a free form. One of the things I try to make sure I remind every parent is that because it's a free form, you should never, ever go onto a website that says, I will help you fill out your FAFSA for $35. Or you can sign up with this organization and this organization will submit your FAFSA for you for $12. If you have questions about how to complete the FAFSA, there are lots of information on the site that you actually apply for the FAFSA, but you can also at any time talk to the financial aid office at any of the schools that you're applying to. That's what we're there for. You should feel that you can't speak to a financial aid office because your child is not at the school or not at the school currently. So just remember that there is free information, free access to guidance, so you should never have to pay for that. After you've completed that form, there are schools that may require that you complete a profile. This is called the College Board Profile. The College Board Profile is a form that is much more extensive than the FAFSA. It does ask for information that is not only from the year that you're currently filing, but the prior year and then the prior year. And then there's also an estimated income piece. It asks for lots of asset information. It asks for a lot of investment information. And the reason that schools will ask for you to complete this form is because they have their own institutional aid. And their own institutional aid is usually in the form of a grant. And therefore, they're allowed to and can use what they call as the College Board Profile so that they can ascertain the need of the family, which is why there is so much information, and then provide you with whatever eligibility your child has for institutional grant funding. Now, this is need-based funding. It's a very big difference between need funding and merit funding. Merit funding, you don't need to fill out any of these forms. Merit funding is based on your admissions and based on academic credentials. So usually when a school is offering merit funding, they're offering merit funding based on your current GPA, based on your current involvement, based on your admissions criteria, strong applicant that you might be. And usually merit funding is also scholarship funding. So again, not something you have to pay back. Scholarship and grant funding are free. You do not have to pay that back. So again, when you're wondering whether a school has merit funding or need-based funding, you should always be checking their websites. Their websites are going to give you a lot of general information about the funding that is available, whether they do provide merit funding what need funding they have. Do they have institutional funding? Every school does not have institutional funding. For example, public institutions, very large public institutions, have very minimal institutional grant funding. Many of them do have merit funding, but again, that's limited. Many of the Ivies, if not all of the Ivies, have institutional grant funding, and they will ask you to complete both the FAFSA and the College Board profile. I would suggest that if you're wondering if you're eligible for financial aid, there's two things that you can do. One, go to the website of the schools and look at what they call the calculator. Every school has some kind of calculator. It could be a cost of attendance calculator, it could be a direct cost calculator, it could be just called a school calculator, but it's a calculator that allows you to determine for yourself, should I apply? Should I try? It's programmed so that it will look at that particular school's cost of attendance, which is the budget, which is the expense for the student to go to school, and it'll add in the information you provide to do an estimate of what is the potential contribution from the family. That potential contribution from the family then helps to assess what would the need be, and therefore what is the possibility for aid to be received to you from the school. It's a very rough estimate, so remember to use the word estimate when you're doing this, but it also gives you an idea of, well, should I apply or shouldn't I apply? My second recommendation is to apply. Do it your first year. There's no harm in applying. The worst that happens is the financial aid office says, we're really sorry, but you're not eligible for any scholarship funding. Doesn't mean that they may not be eligible for work study funding, and it doesn't mean that you may not be eligible for loan funding. So I always suggest, if you're really not sure, or you think you're borderline, or every school has different financial aid policies when it comes to their own institutional funding, try. You don't have to do it the second, third, and fourth year, but at least it gives you landscape. I also think it's very important because some of you may be fortunate enough to not have just one student in school, but two, or three, or four, or more. And as that increases, so does your eligibility for aid, particularly in the federal piece. You are going to become more aid eligible simply by virtue of the fact that all of the needs analysis calculations, all of the determination in terms of eligibility will take into consideration that cost that you will have as a result of having more than one sibling in school. So it's well worth considering, particularly if you're in that situation. Now, I talked about some of the forms. There are also lots of other forms that every institution has their own requirements. Some will ask for tax returns. Some will ask for W-2s. Some will ask for their own institutional forms. Some will ask just for a scholarship form. Some will ask for a waiver form. What you want to do is you want to scope out the websites, particularly the financial aid websites at each of the schools, and the admissions websites at each of the schools that will give you an idea of what are the forms that are required and what are the forms that are not required. And what kinds of funding does institutions have? Do they have merit funding? Do they have institutional grant funding? Is it all scholarship funding? And I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the loan funds. Many of the public schools are going to include in their award notices loan funds. And when you're not familiar with the kinds of loans that are out there, it can be a little daunting and it can be a little frightening. But there is also very good websites, studentloans.gov, very good websites that talk about loan programs and the eligibility for loan programs and the benefits and disadvantages. The two that I will talk about today are the subsidized loan, which is as it's called. It is the loan that the government pays the interest while the student is in school. Can't get a loan like that anywhere. You can't get a mortgage loan like that. You can't get a credit loan like that. This is a loan that offers your student an opportunity to glean either between $2,500 and $3,500 in an academic year that is basically interest-free until you go into repayment, until you've graduated. So if you're eligible, and they'll know if they're eligible after you've completed the FAFSA. Remember that free application that I told you about, the FAFSA? That's the form that will let you know if you're eligible for the subsidized loan. The second loan is the unsubsidized loan, just as it's called. Basically means the student can borrow that loan, doesn't matter whether you're eligible or not eligible. Unsubsidized loans are interest accruing while the student is in school. Again, anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000 a year, and anyone is eligible for that. It isn't going to matter what the results of the FAFSA are. And obviously, again, the interest rate is better because these are federally assured loans and they are fixed interest rates. So, and each year you can check to see what the interest rates are. I'm going to stop with that and just talk a little bit about where we are today. What's the financial world look like today? The good news is there's still a FAFSA. The good news is that there's still Pell. The good news is that there's still work study. These are all great programs for our undergraduate students. And the good news is that you have financial aid offices that are going to help you through the process no matter what. Please make sure you take advantage of us. That's what we're here for. Doesn't matter whether it's Penn, as you can see from behind me, that's where I'm from. It doesn't matter if it's Rutgers. It doesn't matter if it's the local community college. We are all here to help and to provide you guidance and to provide you information when and however you need it, whether it's at the beginning of the process, whether you're 4 years out of it, or whether you're just about to embark upon it. So please don't hesitate to ask us. You, I'm sure, have been reading the headlines. I'm sure you've been reading lots of changes are coming down the road, particularly when it comes to borrowing funds, particularly when it comes to the different kinds of loan programs that are available. The important thing to remember with all of those changes that are currently upon us and will be upon us more starting the fall of 26 is that you want to keep track of your borrowing. You want to keep track of what loans you're borrowing, how much you're borrowing, and you want to think as much as possible about what do you believe the future educational plans are. I know what I'm saying. I know I'm saying your students are embarking as a freshman and they have no clue what they're going to do. Totally get that. But it's really helpful for you as the parent and for the student to think about the long term. They may not want to go to graduate school. They may not want to finish 4 years. They may want to only do 2 years. But think about all of the planning and all of the potential loan borrowing that may exist throughout that process. And I also ask all of you, in all sincerity, to try to be as honest as you possibly can be with your student who's going to be going to school. And what I mean by that is try to let them know what the boundaries are, what is affordable and what isn't affordable. So you're not in the lobby of the school that your son or daughter is in love with, telling them, we just can't afford this. It's the most heart-wrenching conversation I could ever have with a family. And I do have those conversations, and they're so hard. You would do yourself a favor and your son or your daughter a favor by having some of those conversations way ahead of time so that you know what your boundaries are and you know what to expect. I'm going to stop and give Whitney an opportunity to talk about some admissions process.
Elaine, every time I hear you talk about all of these things, I am just reminded about your expertise on this topic and also just the clarity that you're able to provide around what to think about. And I will just say, in my experience as an admissions dean, whatever you think you can afford, you're going to be asked to pay more than that. It's just, it what you think you can afford is, for most families, what keeping things as they are and adding in payments to college, and what's the comfortable number there. And it would surprise me if a family ran into feeling that they have financial need and are given support and but also have a commitment to spend some of their money, that the amount that they're being asked to spend in any of the scenarios that Elaine described will feel reasonable. Like it will feel like more than you thought you would pay. So it is really important to go through the steps that Elaine described to try to get some realistic estimates of what it might cost at different institutions, so that knowing the estimate when it becomes actual numbers may feel very stressful, that it's not so far away from what you thought you might be able to afford that there's just no way to consider it at that point. And it's really not possible, Elena, you can check me on this, but it's really not possible for financial aid offices to tell you in advance what it would cost you to do the analysis on your family, to give you a number so that you know before applying exactly what it would cost. In most cases, that's just it. Penn has more than 100,000 prospective students every year, and most of them seeking aid, and it's just not possible to do that analysis at that point. So you are going to find yourselves as families working in space of estimates, as Elaine said, being really honest with yourself around what you feel you can contribute over time, and also where does that leave you for future education commitments or other commitments that you know you have coming. And I will say that one area for you to investigate before I get to sort of straight up admissions things, is in a crossover of financial aid and admission, is one of the things to look for and make sure you understand at the schools where the student will apply is, what is the relationship of aid to admissions decisions? And so you'll see phrases like need blind, need aware, need sensitive. And what those mean is, in a need blind environment, that means that an admissions office is going to make a decision on the application without any regard to whether or not that student has financial need or how much and how that need might get met. It's just an admission decision on the student. A need aware environment is one in which there is a relationship between admissions wanting to admit somebody and also checking the affordability of the collection of students that they want to admit relative to the financial aid that's available, compared to the need demonstrated in students that they want to admit. And so when that comparison happens, that's an admission office that has to work within the boundaries of financial resource and distribute that resource relative to their policy. So if there's a policy that our school is going to meet, if you're admitted, we're meeting the full need, then they can only admit the students up to the number for which they could meet the full need. And then there are situations where you'll see the combination of need blind and meet full need. Penn is in that category. So that means that we can, in the admission office, read applications, choose to admit a student, give that student's name to Elaine's office, and Elaine has all the financial aid paperwork, and their office goes through the process of doing the analysis, deciding whether or not there is a need to be met, how that will be met, and then when it's time to release decisions, those two things go out together. But it doesn't influence whether we can move forward in deciding to admit somebody. There are other schools that will pair need blind, but no relationship to need or support. So that would be an institution that will say, we're going to admit who we want to admit. It's up to you to figure out if you can afford coming here or not. And we may not have any money to support that, or some limit. It may be just federal funding, but there's no institutional aid to back it up. And so that can sometimes be a gap that will be there, a financial gap for families. And the policies around that should be articulated on most websites of schools, what their admission and aid policies are. So that shouldn't be something you discover at the time a student's admitted, but it is good to look for information about that and have conversations with the financial aid office or admissions office if you're not clear on what the intersection points are there. When I think about admissions now and where we are and the things that I would lay out for you to think about as families with college-bound students is to remember that there are thousands of higher ed institutions in the United States, and with all different levels of selectivity, admissions policies, programs, and mission. And so really the place to start is what is attractive to the student, how do they want to learn, what do they want to learn, what kind of environment feels like it would be inspiring, and look for matching to schools like that to learn about them, maybe visit them. We all have online opportunities to do virtual visiting of schools and learning about schools, which gives us a global opportunity. But to remember that there are not only 50 schools in the United States, even though it seems like there are about 50 that stay in the news. And amazing educations can happen where students feel supported and inspired, and that they're in an environment where they can really feel motivated to go after the things they care about. So the idea of doing the searching is partly for the student and the learning experience, and then also making sure that the financial fit is part of the list of schools that you might be considering. Thinking about schools by name first is interesting, and it can help draw you into where you might start looking. But when it really comes down to the experience, the student is going to live this out. Like day in, day out, this is going to be their likely 4-year experience. And so what matters more is how successful that might be in an environmental match for that student, an academic social match, than the name of said school. It's hard to hold that in our environment right now because it is so common for a short list of schools relative to all the schools that are out there to be used as the examples of good or bad in higher ed. I will also say that as you're investigating schools, in addition to trying to be open to the things that are available in a school that seem to align well with the interests and motivations of your student, is to also use the admission sites, in particular, the application questions that a school might ask, to try to understand what's the disposition of this school toward providing education. What matters to this school? We have limited space in an application to ask questions, especially where many schools are parts of consortium college platforms. So the Common App would be one, which you probably are familiar with. There's another one that is popular called Coalition. QuestBridge is another organization out there with a shared platform. But as an institution, when you're in a shared platform, the basis of that application is shared among all of us. That's what makes it easy for the student. You fill out a primary amount of information once, and then schools can ask supplemental questions to make it more school specific for the kinds of things they want to evaluate. And my advice is to look really carefully at what those supplemental questions are, because they can and should signal what the school cares about. And if there are things that the student just like, I don't even know how to answer these questions. This doesn't make any sense to me. I don't like these questions. That could be a signal that this isn't, it might be an academic match in terms of the rigor of an institution and programming available in an institution with student interest. But if the alignment of what it feels like and what seems important to the institution doesn't register with the student, it's something to think about, because there are probably a lot of schools that they can go through that same exercise and be like, oh, I love this question, and I instantly know what they want to say. to answer it. And I'll give you an example. In the introduction, Lisa talked about the gratitude question that we put in our application. This was several years ago. We started it and we continue to use it. We added a short answer question. It's a required short answer prompt, in which we asked students to write a short thank you note to someone that they had not yet thanked but wanted to acknowledge. And there's a reason for doing that. And the reason for asking something like that was it was an opportunity for every single student, regardless of their background or resources, to be able to demonstrate a moment that they could recall when they noticed and accepted positive influence from another person. And that as a function is it's so important to learning and living in a community with other people, which our school is and is the basis of a lot of learning environments, especially ones that are residential, that we were asking a question that's not a competitive question. You can't have a better or worse kind of gratitude. But you also can't apply to Penn without answering it. It's that important to us that students can have that disposition to noticing the positive interaction with another person. The other thing that was important about that was not only that we wanted that in there because we value it, but that we designed it in a way using the advice of Penn faculty. You may have heard of Adam Grant, who's a psychologist from the Wharton School, or Angela Duckworth, who's wrote a book called Grit and has done a lot of work talking about resiliency and grit, who's also a Penn faculty member, and Marty Seligman, who's known as the father of positive psychology. So these three Penn faculty members took us in admissions through the science of taking it from please write about something for which you're grateful that you recognize as positive influence to writing the thank you note, because the science behind writing thank you, like, and saying thank you actually makes people feel good. And so it was a way to take a value that was important for us to include in our questions and to take advantage of who we have on our campus to have the science to tell us to do it in a particular way that would benefit students. And one of our values is to lessen anxiety in a process that is fraught with anxiety, and to bring clarity to what we're doing. So that's just, and we have other questions as well, like why are you applying to the School of Engineering? Or, we ask a question about community. So the gratitude one is not the only one, but it's an example of that collection of three supplemental questions tells you what's important to us. We're asking you about community. We're asking you about an interaction with someone that you want to thank them for. And then a very straightforward question about why are you applying to this particular school? Because we have 4 undergraduate schools. So I think that can tell you a lot about an institution and help narrow when you're feeling like, oh my gosh, there's so much information everywhere. And I just did this search on Big Futures, which is a College Board search. And I have 100 schools to look at here. And where do we begin? And that's one way, in addition to the searchable things like majors, the size of school, location. It's another thing to look at to help make a connection to a school that feels like it feels good to a student while they're exploring it, investigating it. The other thing that I would say is schools are asking questions for a reason. And I often get asked at Penn, where our application volume is very large. It's over 72,000 students for a class of 2,400. Do you even read them all? Do you even read the essays? And yes, because that's why we're asking questions about your activities and your courses and a longer essay and the supplemental questions. Those are there because they matter for how we're trying to, in our work and how we think about evaluating and assessing a student. Each one of those components matters. And so I think when you're looking at what you're being asked to provide, and particularly if a school is telling you an order in which something might matter, we don't have an order in which it matters, other than you absolutely have to meet an academic threshold to be prepared for what you're going to take on. But otherwise, all of the things that we're asking for have a place in the evaluation, and they all matter. And so you should treat them as if they all matter. And I would also say, I imagine there's a question coming up, or maybe already in the chat, about AI, and we can talk about it in more depth if I don't cover the question now. But I will say, I often get asked, what about AI? Is it even worth writing essays? Because who's writing the essays? Do you allow AI? Can you detect it? Does it matter? And you'll get different answers from different schools on this. And so you really should, when you're ready to apply, you should know what schools' policies are about the use of AI. And speaking for Penn, I'll talk you through how we're thinking about it, because once you understand how we think about it, it might help you shape the questions you want to ask at other schools for how they use it. But when students apply to us, no matter what platform they're using, they have to sign at the end of it an attestation that the work is honestly represented and the work is their own. And so could a student do the whole thing in AI and sign that? Sure, they could. It calls, it's an integrity problem to do that, and we might not know it. But there are other ways in which students have to determine where the interventions that they've had on their application fit into that integrity attestation. So, students get help from peers, from parents. Sometimes they work on essays in their English classes. So there's teacher support in how to prepare and craft and review and, get an essay really tidy and ready to send it in. And we know all of those things happen, and they're not inherently bad or unjust. Is if I think a student knows, and adults know, when somebody else is actually doing the work, then it's not accurate to sign off and say it's your own work. To get support in your work is another thing, and AI can do that. It's also an opportunity for support and review and tidiness in writing that students without access to other people who can help them in this process finally have a way of getting support in presenting the application the way that they want to, where for decades, since the beginning, there are applicants who've been able to turn to other people in their lives for that kind of help. So we don't have a rule against AI, but we do have a rule and expectation that students are abiding by what they're signing their names to. And that would be that they believe that the work that they're turning in that application is theirs, which doesn't mean it can't have been reviewed by or inspired by other things, including AI. But we're an institution that has an AI major for, and we have AI centers at Penn. So it's an AI environment in the university. So it would be strange for us to say, AI, you can't have been near AI for this, but we do expect students to present their own work. And then the last thing that I will say is understanding the rounds of application and deadlines. Elaine, you didn't touch on deadlines, but I think I can speak for both of us that the deadlines are real. Like, they're not suggestions. Like, we really mean it. And the reason is because the amount of work that happens with what you turn in, and because I think this is human nature, but this is definitely teenage nature, that it is last minute submission stuff. So I've been doing this for over 30 years, and still we get half or maybe 70% of our applications in the last 48 hours. So when our applications open, I mean, it's open now, but we don't start working with them in any way until later in the fall. We'll get 30 to 50% of the applications in advance of that last 48 hours, and then they all come in. So if you're late, like the time that we have is so compressed to do the work, and we don't get as much of a head start on the work as we would like because the students wait right until the deadline. Being late, we'll read it, and we'll read it with the same integrity that we read applications that came in first. But you're doing yourself a favor by being prepared and getting your material in on time. There are schools particularly related to financial aid that cannot consider you if you've missed a deadline. And there's no movability on that. So the deadlines do matter. You'll hear about early decision, which is a binding commitment in a school. You're signing a document as a parent or as a guardian. The school counselor signing it and the student signing it, saying, if you admit me in this round, I will come. And if I have applications out into any other schools, I will withdraw them. I'm a sure thing. I will be there for orientation. And the loophole for all of that is that unless you're applying for financial aid and financial aid terms and your family cannot get to an agreement, then you would not be required to enroll. But early decision is, I'm coming, I'm a sure thing. And typically one of 3 different decisions would come back to a student who applied that way. You're admitted, it's exciting, you have a seat in the class, we're counting on you coming, and done. Like you're locked in. You could be denied, outright denied, no chance to be reviewed again. And that's pretty straightforward. It's tough news at the beginning of a otherwise stressful process, but it's also clear. So it allows you to divert your attention to places that might be able to hold a spot for you. Or you might get deferred, which means you are still in consideration and going to be reviewed again with the broader pool, and you'll get a final decision with that group. And at that point, you don't have an obligation to enroll. So if you were to be deferred and then admitted, you could enroll at that school, or you could choose to enroll somewhere else if you've been admitted somewhere else. You could apply early action, which is also an early deadline and an early answer back, but you're not required to enroll and you're not required to reply until their standard reply date, which is usually in early May. And then there is regular decision admission, which is usually our biggest cohort of applicants. And from there we could admit, and it will include deferred students in that review. And we would either admit, deny, waitlist regular decision applicants, but at Penn, we don't waitlist students who've been deferred from ED. So if we've deferred them, we're going to make a yes or a no decision on that next decision round. Some schools will waitlist a student who's been deferred, so that's not a rule that applies everywhere, but that's our policy on that. And then you'll find rolling admissions, which is applications are reviewed as they come in and decisions come out on a rolling basis. And when that starts and when it closes would be on the institutional website. So that's another way of applying. And then the other thing I would say is just make sure that you're communicating with the people that you need to have support you in your application, whether that's a high school counselor, recommenders, teachers, coaches, whoever it is that you need to be working on your behalf. It takes a lot of time to write a good recommendation for somebody. It takes a lot of time to keep track of materials that you're submitting on behalf of somebody that your counselor would be doing. And so you will find that you are well appreciated if you are communicative well in advance of what you actually need. And that will go a long way in the experience that you're having, just to be less stressful. If you can make it less stressful for the people helping you by not rushing them, it's going to be less stressful for the student and for the family. And then the last thing I'll say is this is truly an exciting time. It's stressful. It's easy to get wrapped into how pervasive the stress conversation is. Like it's a rite of passage and the stress starts so early and what's going to happen. And that's true. But there's another way to work through that, which is there are thousands of colleges. Don't pre-decide what they need to be. Follow a process that makes sense for your family, for your kid, and there will be an outcome that's going to make sense. The amplification of anxiety is working toward a predetermined outcome that you cannot control, that many people will try to tell you can be controlled if you do X, Y, and Z. And it's just not, it's not realistic advice, and it's very stressful to have to abide by it. I would really encourage you to look for what do the schools tell you they care about, look at what they're asking, make some assumptions about why they're asking it and what it means, and don't look to places other than the schools to tell you what that school cares about. If you're not sure what they mean or what they want in their application, ask them. It will go a long way in minimizing the stress. All right, that's what I had to say. So we can
Thank you,
questions.
Whitney,
Yeah.
and thank you, Elaine. Super, super helpful from both of you. We have a ton of questions, so this is going to be a bit of a lightning round. Um, if you've asked some questions, Elaine, thank you. I noticed while Whitney was chatting, Elaine was answering some of the questions in the chat. So just scroll through the chat because some of the answers there. Elaine, if you don't mind jumping in at this point, we have a lot of questions about divorce and the FAFSA. If you don't mind touching on that for a few moments.
No, not at all. And I thought I was going to answer it in the chat, but there's no easy way answer to that question. So thank you for, pointing that out, Lisa. It always is going to depend on the policy at the school. But what I can tell you is that when you're completing the FAFSA, it will ask you very clear questions about who should complete the FAFSA. The terminology is custodial or non-custodial. To answer which one you are will be to answer the questions at the beginning of the FAFSA. It'll ask you a series of questions, things like, do you claim the student? Have you received funding for the student? Are you the primary person funding this student? Are you the primary income earner for the student? Has the student received any funding whatsoever from the non-custodial if you're not the non-custodial? Does the student have any contact with the non-custodial? So all of those kinds of things help to determine whether you're completing as the custodial or as the non-custodial. That's the first part. The second part is the non-custodial, the other parent, whoever that is, does need to complete the FAFSA. And when you're answering these questions, the student is answering some of these questions, and the student will provide the contact information for both parents. So the FAFSA, or the Department of Ed, is going to contact both parents and say, we have received information from the student. You are parent A, you are parent B. Totally separate. Parent A and parent B will not be communicated together. Parent A will not know parent B was asked. Parent B will not know parent A was asked. Parent A and parent B will never see each other's forms, and the school has no right to share those forms. So you need to know that that remains confidential across the board. And both parents will then be required to complete the form. The same thing is applicable to the College Board profile. So if the College Board profile is a form that the school asks for, they will ask also for the non-custodial parent to complete the form. And I do see a question that says, what if the parent is not involved in the child's life? That will be an appeal process after the custodial and the non-custodial form has been requested. That will be when you, as the parent, will be in touch with the financial aid office and may be required to provide some level of documentation regarding that other parent not being in the child's life. It could be a letter from a student counselor. It could be divorce agreement. It could be a separation agreement. It could be a series of documents, depending on the circumstances, that the school will ask for to document that that other parent is not in the child's life. and therefore giving the school the opportunity to waive the requirement of the non-custodial parent. And that will differ depending on the school. I thought the FAF was only filled out by custodial parent. Has that changed? No, both parents have always had to complete the FAFSA. What's changed is that not only both initial parents had to complete the FAFSA, but if one of the parents was now remarried, that person also had to complete the FAFSA. So there was a time when 4 individuals had to complete the FAFSA.
Whitney, we've got a question here about the SAT being reinstated at some schools and how this is going to impact admissions. The
Yeah, that's a
requirement
great
to take the SAT or the ACT, I should say.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as you know, many schools, well, there were many schools that were test optional before the pandemic. Majority of schools became test optional in the pandemic, and some schools are working their way back to being test required again. Penn is one of those schools, will be test required for this application cycle, and this will be the first year that we are since the pandemic. And so, what I would say is when schools are test optional, you should follow their guidance on what that means for their school. And almost every school I've ever seen has a statement on their website when it gets to the testing requirement or test optional requirement, what that means for them. So you might see, and what I mean by that is you might see language that says, we are test optional, but testing, we encourage you to submit testing if you have it. That's different from a school saying we are test optional and you will be treated exactly the same with or without your testing. So like that's different. One school's indicating a preference to see it if you can provide it. Another one saying you do whatever you want, it won't matter. But as schools are reverting back to testing, it's really important to look at what the requirements are. I know this is more work, but it is really important to do the homework of what is each school saying about what they're requiring and how you might fulfill that requirement. So a return to testing might be straight up SAT, ACT, and English language testing if you're in a non-English learning environment. But it could mean ACT, SAT, or some combination of other tests, right? And so now there are many flavors of what test required looks like and how you can meet the requirement. At Penn, ours is pretty straightforward. We've never really worked in an environment without testing, but it also has never been a primary component of our application review when it was required pre-pandemic. It was never part of our academic assessment. It was a standalone variable that we looked at separately, but the basis of our academic assessment never include testing. Same when it was test optional. Our approach to assessment, because it didn't include testing before, worked perfectly without testing being required. And now that we're going back to requiring testing, we know that the test optional was really appealing for students who have trouble accessing testing. And so we wanted to make sure we didn't lose those students in the applicant pool. We have a waiver built into our application where when you get to the requirement, you say you're submitting the ACT or the SAT, or you need a waiver. And it can be, you can hit a bullet button for the reason. And if the reasons we offer aren't accounting for the reason that you don't have a test, there's an other and you can write that in and it's waived. Like we're not going back to check. Again, we're expecting the integrity of our applicant pool to not withhold tests that they have because they prefer that. It's not a test optional space. It's a test required, but there's a way to apply if you don't have the test. And examples of not having it would be financial hardship and being able to register for a test was canceled after you took it and you can't take another, you can't get to a testing site. Would be really common examples of why somebody might not have a test result to submit. And we want to see those students anyway.
Terrific. Here's a question that's sort of a bit for both of you. A parent keeps hearing that you should not do early decision if you need financial aid. And we're talking early decision here, as Whitney described, the binding early decision. Is that the case? Are you better off to wait, see what the offers are, and even try and negotiate for more aid once you've seen what your students' financial aid offers might be?
Right, I'm going to start, but Elaine, I think you're going to need to come in here, particularly for the latter half of that question and take that. If if aid is going to be a driving factor in whether or not your student can attend, it might be worthwhile to not be locked into a place early so that you can see what kind of financial aid offers come in with admission offers and make a decision with all of that information in front of you about where the student will attend. That also makes sense for the financial health in the family. If you're applying to a school that is going to meet your full need, and there are many schools that are committed to doing that, then you're in a best case scenario situation outside of merit money. That whether it's early or spring, it's the same amount of money that you would get from an institution that's telling you we're going to fill the gap between what you can afford and what we cost. And so that is a less risky commitment. And even so, like I said earlier, if the financial aid that is offered for an early decision student is not one that the family can reconcile, then we can release the family from the early decision. But the problem is that was your early decision option time. So if it's really critical, I think it's a family decision on whether or not to make that commitment in early. But I think for schools that are able to meet the full need, it's much less risky to do that. The negotiating, Elaine, I think that's one for you to take up.
Yeah, I will just add, all Ivy schools are need-based. So that means that we have no merit money. And that means, as Whitney just described, we are committed to funding up to need. So it isn't going to matter whether you're ED, EA, or RD. You're going to get the same amount of money because it's based on your need. Now, again, as Whitney said, putting Ivies aside, and there are other schools besides Ivy schools that do that very similar practice. If you are from a family that the money matters, what you get is going to matter for the decision, then you want to look at, as I shared earlier, whether the schools have merit money. And you want to ask the questions of the admissions office and of the financial aid office at those schools as to what is the average merit funding. It's okay to ask that. The school may or may not share it with you, but it is absolutely okay to ask that because it gives you an idea of how to plan for that particular school. In regards to negotiating, there's always an opportunity to what we call appeal. It doesn't matter what the school is. It doesn't matter if it's Ivy, if it's a non-Ivy, if it's a public school. If you've received a financial aid package and you look at it and you say, I can't make this work and this is where I want to be, there's always an appeal process. It's not guaranteed that the appeal will result in a change, but there's always an appeal process. And what I would recommend is with each appeal process, it's much more valuable for you to have a conversation with someone in the financial aid office so they can truly understand who you are and where you're coming from. Because financial aid officers also know what questions to ask. And sometimes families don't know what they should share, what they shouldn't share, and financial circumstances are very, very private. So it gives the financial aid officer an opportunity to get a fuller picture.
Terrific. We only have a few minutes left. Elaine, there's another question here for you. With the newly passed bill, do students have to exhaust their federal loan options before Parent Plus loans can be taken? Is the $65,000 cap on Parent Plus loans per student or per borrower? ChatGPT is giving 7 different answers.
Please don't talk to ChatGPT. The Department of
Exactly.
Education doesn't know the answer. ChatGPT is not going to know the answer. It's all of that is very, very confusing. But what I will say to you is there's a difference between someone who's already borrowed and is in the program versus someone who is not borrowed. And if we assume that the audience here is an audience of students who have never borrowed before, then when you borrow in the fall of 2026, you will be a first-time borrower. And as a first-time borrower, you will be in the position of the new regulations that talk about new caps. And those new caps have to do with the unsubsidized loan and the Parent Plus loan. The subsidized loan, remember, that's the one the government's paying the interest on, does not have any changes to it. So if you go to studentloans.gov right now and you look up subsidized loan, what you see now is what you will see next year. But the unsubsidized loan is where you have the cap in the borrowing, and the borrowing needs to happen on the student side before the parent is able to borrow. And where you see a cap on the parent borrowing, which is also very critical to you being able to figure out what you can afford, there is a cap on the borrowing, and the $65,000 is an aggregate cap. It is not an annual cap, which means that you can borrow each of your years, but once you've reached that 65,000 mark, you're no longer able to borrow. So that is something you need to think about when you're thinking about how much you're going to commit, how much you can cost, how much the school's going to cost. And finally, what I would say to you is federal loans are one thing, private educational loans are something else. There is an opportunity to look at private educational loans. I don't mean private loans that you take out with your own credit and you put your house on the market. I'm talking about private educational loans. They are loans that are intended for an education. They are an opportunity, they are an option, and if you do need to go that route, the student is the borrower, not the parent.
Terrific.
Can I
I
just add one thing about ChatGPT? Can I just
absolutely, Whitney, jump in.
beg families don't rely on ChatGPT to tell you what's what. You have no idea what it's trolling, and there's so much bad, incorrect information out on sites that it's collecting from things that no admissions person would ever endorse. So really go to the places that you care about and ask the questions from a person.
I promised both Whitney and Elaine that we would finish by 9 o'clock, so we have one more minute. Whitney, when a student has a question about admissions or a parent, I assume you don't mind when parents ask financial questions. I know you want students to ask the application questions, but obviously some of the financial questions are complicated.
Sure.
And maybe a parent needs to know when you say call the school, who do they call? I mean, what do we look? What's the number they're looking for? How do they reach out to you? When is that really available? And will a human really pick up the phone?
Yes. So I would go to the admission site if you have an admission question, go to the financial aid site if you have a financial aid question, or just find one of them, and if they can get you to the other one if you started in the wrong place. But we have staff whose entire jobs are to answer the phone and to respond to emails. So the numbers that we provide are connecting to people who can provide answers. Now, there's an opportunity for AI to do some bot answering. We don't have that set up, but that would be a good use of AI for the most common questions, which could point you to this is who you need to talk to, and like take up the question with a person. But you should expect to be having access to a person in a financial aid office or an admission office, even if you have to go through some AI questions. If a school has a bot going for their entry point, same way when you're trying to figure out something in customer service, for a retailer online, you start with like, can I help you? And you're like, no, get me to an agent. It's like same kind of thing you might run into with bots on admission sites, but you can get to a human being, which is the goal.
Terrific. Thank you both so much for your time. It was super, super informative to everyone here. I can see the parents stayed through the whole evening, and I'm just very grateful to both of you for making so many complex things much clearer for us.
Happy to do it.
I wish you all much success.
Same. Yeah.
Thank you.
Have fun with it if you can. I really, it's an exciting time.
All right. Good night, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.